Hello, and welcome to The Dull Narrator. Today, I will be telling you a story so remarkably uneventful, so impressively ordinary, that it may gently guide your mind into a state of calm, stillness, or perhaps a very pleasant nap. This is the story of the Cold War historical fiction of USA. The phone on the wall began ringing at 2:13 in the morning. Not loudly, not urgently, just steadily. A tired Air Force lieutenant named Daniel Mercer stared at it from across the dim underground operations room beneath Oft Air Force Base in Nebraska. The fluorescent lights above him hummed softly. Cigarette smoke drifted in pale gray layers beneath the ceiling. Around him, dozens of men in uniform worked quietly over radar displays and stacks of paper that could determine whether the world survived the next hour. The ringing continued. Nobody moved, because every man in that room knew the rule. If that particular phone rang after midnight, somebody somewhere had probably seen Soviet bombers on radar. Daniel finally stood. His chair scraped the concrete floor. The room became silent enough for him to hear the ventilation fans behind the walls. He lifted the receiver. Mercer speaking? There was no greeting on the other end. Only breathing. Then a voice said very calmly, "We may have lost Greenland." Daniel did not understand the sentence at first. Nobody lost Greenland. Greenland was ice, weather stations, and radar installations buried beneath snow. It was one of the quiet corners of the Cold War. A frozen listening post sitting between the Soviet Union and North America. Losing Greenland would be like losing a thermometer. But then the voice added, "Thule radar has gone dark. We are getting conflicting reports of unidentified aircraft crossing the polar route." And suddenly, every cigarette in the room seemed to stop burning. Daniel looked toward the giant map stretched across the far wall. Thin, glowing lines represented possible Soviet bomber routes over the Arctic. One of those routes led directly to Chicago, another to Washington, another to New York. The Cold War had trained millions of Americans to imagine nuclear war as a sudden explosion, a flash, a mushroom cloud, an ending. But the real Cold War rarely felt like that. Most of the time it felt like this: quiet rooms, coffee growing cold, phones ringing in the middle of the night, men trying to decide whether humanity was about to die because a radar station somewhere in the Arctic stopped transmitting. Daniel covered the receiver. "Get Strategic Air Command on standby." Nobody asked questions. Chairs rolled backward. Telephones were grabbed. Code books opened. Far above them, beyond the concrete ceiling, Nebraska remained asleep under winter darkness. Families slept in warm houses. Truck drivers crossed lonely highways. Teenagers dreamed about cars and baseball and girls. None of them knew that within the next 30 minutes, a handful of exhausted officers might accidentally start World War III. That was the true terror of the Cold War. Not hatred, not ideology, human error. Daniel Mercer had been born in 1928 in a small town outside Des Moines, Iowa. His father had fought in France during the First World War and returned home with damaged lungs from mustard gas exposure. His mother taught piano lessons in their living room during the Great Depression, while neighbors quietly lost farms, homes, and sometimes hope itself. Daniel grew up hearing two kinds of stories. One was about sacrifice, the other was about fear. His father believed America survived only because ordinary people were willing to prepare for terrible things before they arrived. So when Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, Daniel watched his father sit silently at the kitchen table for nearly an hour after hearing the news on the radio. Then the older man stood up, opened a closet, and removed his old uniform. Not because he could still fight, because he wanted to remember. Millions of Americans felt the same thing. The Second World War transformed the United States from a recovering nation to an industrial giant unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories in Detroit produced tanks instead of automobiles. Shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Women entered factories in enormous numbers. Scientists created weapons capable of ending entire cities. And when the war ended in 1945, the United States emerged wealthier and more powerful than nearly every nation on Earth. But victory carried a strange new anxiety, because another power had survived the war too, the Soviet Union. Americans had once viewed the Soviets as temporary allies against Nazi Germany. That illusion died quickly. By 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. Eastern European countries fell under Soviet influence one after another. American newspapers began printing maps filled with expanding red territory. The Cold War had begun. The name itself sounded harmless: cold, controlled, distant. But for the men responsible for preventing nuclear war, it felt hotter every year. Daniel joined the Air Force in 1950 during the Korean War. He had considered law school. Instead, he found himself sitting inside radar stations, listening for Soviet bombers that might never come. The military liked men like Daniel. Calm, careful, not emotional. The problem was that the Cold War slowly turned calm men into haunted ones. By the late 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons powerful enough to destroy civilization many times over. The phrase mutually assured destruction entered military language. It sounded clinical, almost academic. In reality, it meant this: if either side launched nuclear weapons, both sides would probably vanish. Entire cities became targets. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills beneath wooden desks that would never protect them from thermonuclear fire. Families built backyard fallout shelters stocked with canned food and bottled water. Magazines explained how to survive radiation. Government films calmly instructed citizens what to do during nuclear attack, as though atomic war might resemble a snowstorm. Daniel hated those films because he knew the truth. There was no real preparation for nuclear war, only procedures. The phone lines inside SAC headquarters buzzed continuously. Another officer approached Daniel with fresh reports. Still no confirmation from Thule. Daniel rubbed his eyes. How many aircraft signatures? Possibly 6. Possibly, the most dangerous word in military intelligence. Not yes, not no, possibly. Daniel walked toward the massive plotting board where technicians updated incoming radar information using long wooden markers. The room smelled of coffee and sweat. Nobody spoke above a whisper. The Cold War rewarded silence. Too much confidence could kill millions.
Outside America, the world was changing rapidly. The Soviet Union tested hydrogen bombs. China became communist. Berlin split into eastern and western sectors. Spies crossed borders carrying microfilm hidden in cigarette packs. Submarines disappeared beneath Arctic ice, carrying enough warheads to erase continents. The Cold War spread into every corner of human life. Sports became political. Space became political. Science became political. Even music became political. American jazz musicians toured foreign countries as symbols of freedom, while Soviet orchestras performed to demonstrate cultural superiority. Every achievement carried ideological weight. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, many Americans reacted as though aliens had landed.
The tiny satellite itself posed little physical threat. Its psychological effect was enormous. If the Soviets could place a satellite over American skies, they could probably deliver nuclear weapons too. Panic spread through Washington. Schools emphasized science education. Defense spending exploded. The space race began. Daniel remembered standing outside a diner in Omaha, watching Sputnik cross the night sky, a small moving point of light, silent, harmless looking. An entire crowd stared upward without speaking. An old farmer finally muttered, "They beat us up there." Nobody argued. America feared losing not merely territory or battles, it feared losing the future. The Soviet Union understood this perfectly. So did the Central Intelligence Agency, so did the Pentagon, and so did politicians who discovered that fear could move voters faster than hope. By the early 1960s, the Cold War dominated American politics completely. Senators accused rivals of communist sympathies. Hollywood actors were blacklisted. Government employees lost careers over suspicion alone. Fear became a national habit. Yet everyday life continued. That was the strange contradiction. Teenagers danced to rock and roll music while nuclear submarines patrolled beneath oceans. Families watched sitcoms while bomb shelters were constructed beneath cities. Children traded baseball cards while military planners calculated acceptable civilian casualty estimates. History rarely feels dramatic while people are living through it. Most of the time it feels ordinary, until suddenly it does not. The officer at Daniel's side cleared his throat. "We have visual confirmation from Canadian intercept stations." Daniel turned sharply. "How many?" "Unknown. Unknown again. Always unknown." Another telephone rang, then another. Messages arrived from Alaska, from Newfoundland, from NORAD facilities carved into mountains. For several terrible minutes, scattered radar signatures appeared to suggest multiple aircraft crossing from the Arctic. Strategic Air Command prepared bomber crews. Pilots climbed into aircraft already loaded with nuclear weapons. Engines started. The Cold War depended heavily on speed. If Soviet missiles launched, American leaders might have less than 30 minutes to respond, sometimes less. That pressure infected every decision. Daniel remembered a training instructor once telling a classroom full of young officers, "In nuclear war, hesitation kills nations." Years later, Daniel concluded the opposite might also be true. Haste could kill nations just as easily. At 3:07 a.m., the radar contact vanished, not gradually, instantly. Technicians rechecked equipment, phones buzzed, more reports arrived. Then, finally, the explanation emerged. An atmospheric disturbance over the Arctic had interfered with radar systems after unusual solar activity. There were no Soviet bombers, no incoming attack, no war. The room exhaled as one enormous, exhausted organism. A lieutenant laughed nervously. Another man sat down and covered his face with both hands. Daniel remained standing.
because what frightened him most was not the mistake itself. It was how close the system had come to reacting automatically.
One misunderstanding, one bad radar reading, one nervous commander. That was all a civilization required to disappear. And the terrifying part was that similar incidents occurred repeatedly throughout the Cold War, sometimes publicly, usually secretly. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in human history. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted only 13 days. For people inside governments, it felt like 13 years. American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible decision. If America attacked Cuba, nuclear war might begin. If America did nothing, Soviet missiles could permanently threaten major American cities. For nearly 2 weeks, the world balanced above an abyss. Daniel spent most of that crisis underground. Bomber crews remained on alert. Nuclear submarines disappeared into oceans. American families watched television broadcasts, searching presidential speeches for signs of panic. Church attendance increased dramatically. Grocery stores sold out of canned food. Children sensed fear in adult voices, even when nobody explained why. Daniel received a handwritten letter from his younger sister during the crisis. She lived in Kansas City with her husband and 2 sons. The letter contained only one question: should we leave the city? Daniel never answered, because he genuinely did not know. If nuclear war started, nowhere would truly be safe. One evening during the crisis, Daniel walked outside the base after midnight. Nebraska air carried the sharp, cold smell of autumn fields. Above him, the stars looked impossibly calm. A mechanic smoked beside a runway. Farther away, B-52 bombers waited in darkness. Each aircraft carried enough destructive power to erase entire populations. The mechanic noticed Daniel staring. "Funny, isn't it?" the man said. "What?" "That everything still looks normal." Daniel never forgot that sentence, because the Cold War often resembled a stage play where the scenery remained cheerful while actors quietly prepared for apocalypse behind the curtain. The crisis eventually ended after tense negotiations. The Soviet Union agreed to remove missiles from Cuba. The United States secretly agreed to remove certain missiles from Turkey. Human civilization survived. Barely. Many Americans later remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis as proof of strong leadership. Inside military circles, some remembered it differently, as luck, pure luck. The Cold War continued for decades afterward. Vietnam, Berlin, Afghanistan, espionage operations across continents, proxy wars that killed millions far from Washington and Moscow. To ordinary Americans, the Cold War sometimes appeared distant. To intelligence officers, pilots, submarine crews, and diplomats, it never truly slept. Daniel eventually transferred into intelligence analysis during the late 1960s. His hair grayed early. He drank too much coffee. He slept poorly. His marriage collapsed quietly after years of secrecy and long absences. His wife once told him, "You look like a man waiting for something terrible to happen." She was correct. Entire generations of Cold War officials lived that way, waiting. The Soviet Union did the same. That is one of the strangest truths about the Cold War. Both sides feared each other deeply, while simultaneously misunderstanding each other constantly.
American leaders often imagined Soviet aggression everywhere. Soviet leaders often believed America planned invasion. Each side interpreted defensive actions as offensive threats. The nuclear arms race accelerated partly because fear itself became self-sustaining. Every new missile required another missile. Every submarine required another submarine. Every technological breakthrough increased anxiety rather than security. The world entered an age where humanity possessed the power to destroy itself faster than it could understand itself. Daniel saw this firsthand during classified briefings. Charts displayed projected casualty numbers from hypothetical nuclear exchanges. Not thousands, millions, tens of millions. Some estimates exceeded 100 million dead within weeks. Cities became mathematical variables. Chicago, Moscow, Los Angeles, Leningrad, New York, targets. Daniel hated those meetings most because eventually human beings stopped looking like people on paper. They became statistics. One winter afternoon in 1971, Daniel visited Washington for consultations at the Pentagon. Snow drifted across the city while tourists photographed monuments outside. Inside secure conference rooms, analysts discussed Soviet missile deployments. During a lunch break, Daniel walked alone near the Lincoln Memorial. Children played in snow near the reflecting pool. A vendor sold hot pretzels nearby. For several minutes, the Cold War felt absurdly distant. Then military helicopters passed overhead, and reality returned. America during the Cold War was a nation living two lives simultaneously, one public, one hidden. The public life contained prosperity, suburban neighborhoods, television shows, highways, moon landings, and consumer abundance. The hidden life contained emergency bunkers, assassination plots, nuclear launch protocols, spy networks, and plans for civilization after atomic war. Few citizens ever saw the hidden machinery, but it shaped the modern world profoundly. The space race alone transformed technology permanently. Competition between the United States and Soviet Union accelerated advances in computing, telecommunications, engineering, and science. When American astronauts landed on the moon in 1969, the achievement represented far more than exploration. It was ideological theater performed on a planetary scale. Daniel watched the moon landing inside a crowded military lounge. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto lunar soil, several officers applauded. One colonel quietly cried, not because of the scientific achievement, because America had finally regained psychological ground after years of Soviet space successes. Cold War victories were often emotional victories. Prestige mattered enormously. Perception mattered enormously. Even Olympic Games became symbolic battlefields. American and Soviet athletes carried invisible political expectations every time they competed. Defeat meant more than losing. It meant ideological weakness. The Cold War transformed ordinary human competition into geopolitical struggle. It also produced extraordinary paranoia. The CIA conducted covert operations across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Soviet intelligence agencies did the same. Governments rose and fell under invisible pressure. Coups occurred. Revolutions received secret funding. Propaganda spread through newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and cultural organizations. Truth itself sometimes became difficult to identify. Daniel learned this painfully in 1974 when an intelligence report crossed his desk regarding a possible Soviet submarine incident in the Atlantic. The report contained contradictory evidence. Satellite images suggested one conclusion, intercepted communications suggested another. Analysts argued for hours. Eventually, Daniel realized nobody truly understood what had happened. Yet senior officials still demanded certainty. That was another dangerous feature of the Cold War.
Leaders often wanted absolute answers in situations where absolute answers did not exist, and nuclear weapons left little room for misunderstanding. One night, Daniel attended a private gathering hosted by retired military officers in Virginia. Most guests drank heavily. Stories flowed, old tensions resurfaced. Near midnight, a former Navy commander described tracking Soviet submarines during particularly tense moments of the Cold War. The man stared into his whiskey glass while speaking. "You know what scared us most?" Daniel shook his head. "Not the Russians." The commander looked up. "The machines." Several men nodded immediately. Computers became increasingly central to nuclear defense systems during the 1970s and 1980s. Early warning networks monitored missile launches. Satellites scanned for heat signatures. Radar systems fed information into increasingly complex command structures. Technology promised faster reaction times. It also introduced new forms of risk. False alarms occurred repeatedly, sometimes because of hardware failures, sometimes because of software errors, sometimes because sunlight reflected strangely off clouds. And every false alarm forced exhausted human beings to decide whether the end of civilization had begun. Daniel eventually lost count of how many close calls remained classified. The public knew only fragments. The reality was far more unsettling. In 1983, another crisis erupted. Relations between the United States and Soviet Union deteriorated sharply after years of tension. President Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. The Soviet military became deeply suspicious of possible American first strike preparations. That same year, Soviet air defenses shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 when the civilian airliner accidentally entered restricted airspace. 269 people died. Fear intensified globally. Then, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer. To American planners, the exercise simulated nuclear command procedures. To some Soviet leaders, it appeared potentially real. Daniel by then worked in senior intelligence coordination. He reviewed reports suggesting unusual Soviet military readiness. Air units dispersed, missile crews prepared, communications activity increased. For several horrifying days, American analysts worried the Soviet Union might genuinely believe nuclear war was imminent. And if one side believed war had already begun, actual war could follow automatically. Daniel slept inside his office for 3 nights. He dreamed constantly about telephones ringing, about radar screens glowing, about cities vanishing. The Cold War consumed people psychologically, even when nothing happened, especially when nothing happened, because anticipation corrodes the mind slowly. One classified briefing during that period particularly disturbed him. An analyst presented computer projections regarding likely casualties from a full-scale nuclear exchange. The room remained professionally silent. Then someone asked how quickly medical systems would collapse. The analyst replied, "Within hours." Another asked about food distribution, disrupted nationally. Electricity, transportation, communications, water systems, all vulnerable. The modern world suddenly appeared fragile. Daniel left the briefing feeling physically ill. Outside the Pentagon, commuters sat in traffic beneath clear blue skies. A radio somewhere played pop music. Tourists photographed the Washington Monument. Civilization continued peacefully, while experts quietly calculated how civilization might end. Yet, despite all the fear, something remarkable also happened during the Cold War. Human beings repeatedly stepped back from disaster. Not always gracefully, not always morally, but repeatedly.
Diplomats negotiated. Scientists communicated across ideological divides. Arms control treaties emerged. Hotlines connected Washington and Moscow directly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, precisely because leaders recognized how dangerous misunderstanding had become. The Cold War was not merely a contest between systems, it was also a continuous struggle between fear and restraint. Daniel retired from government service in 1986. He was 58 years old. His hearing had faded slightly. He carried chronic insomnia. He also carried secrets he could never fully discuss. At his retirement ceremony, a general praised his decades of service protecting national security. Applause filled the room. Daniel smiled politely, but privately he wondered whether history would ever understand how close humanity had come to annihilation during those years. Most Americans remembered the Cold War through speeches, elections, films, and headlines. The people inside the machinery remembered it differently, as tension, as exhaustion, as endless uncertainty. Retirement proved difficult. Daniel moved to Colorado Springs. He read constantly, walked frequently, avoided television news, but the Cold War followed him. Every newspaper headline about Soviet relations tightened something inside his chest. Every emergency siren reminded him of underground command centers. One evening, he visited a grocery store during a thunderstorm. A sudden power outage darkened the building. For several seconds, customers laughed nervously while employees searched for flashlights. Daniel froze completely, because for one brief irrational moment he believed nuclear war had begun. That was the psychological legacy of the Cold War. Millions carried invisible anxiety for decades. Children who practiced atomic drills became adults who subconsciously associated sirens with apocalypse. Military personnel learned to interpret ordinary technical malfunctions as possible civilization-ending events. Even entertainment reflected these fears. Films about nuclear war, espionage, and invasion dominated American culture. The possibility of sudden destruction became normalized. Then something unexpected happened. The Soviet Union began weakening internally. Economic problems worsened. Political pressures increased. The war in Afghanistan drained resources. Reform movements spread across Eastern Europe. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in the mid-1980s, he introduced reforms known as glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. Few Americans initially understood how significant these changes might become. Daniel certainly did not. He had spent most of his adult life assuming the Cold War would outlive him. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall began falling. Television images showed East and West Germans celebrating together atop concrete barriers that had symbolized division for decades. Crowds used hammers and chisels to break apart the wall itself. The images looked surreal. Daniel watched silently from his living room, because for years the Berlin Wall had represented permanence, a dividing line between rival worlds. Suddenly, ordinary civilians were dismantling it piece by piece. History sometimes changes slowly, then all at once. The Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended not with nuclear fire, but with economic collapse, political reform, exhaustion, and accumulated pressure. For many Americans, the ending felt strangely anticlimactic. After decades of existential fear, there was no final battle, no surrender ceremony aboard a battleship, no dramatic conclusion. One superpower simply unraveled. Daniel found that almost unsettling. He had prepared mentally for catastrophe his entire life. Peace felt unfamiliar. In December 1991, he visited Washington again for the first time in years. Snow drifted across the Capitol, just as it had during his Pentagon visit 2 decades earlier. Tourists still photographed monuments. Children still played near the reflecting pool. Street vendors still sold pretzels. Yet something invisible had changed. The shadow hanging over the world had lightened slightly. Not disappeared, but lightened. Daniel walked slowly past the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Names reflected darkly in polished stone. The Cold War had shaped nearly every major conflict of the second half of the 20th century. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, countless covert operations, countless proxy struggles, millions dead worldwide. And yet, many younger Americans barely understood how deeply the Cold War had influenced daily life. To them, it was history. To Daniel, it still felt immediate. That evening, he entered a quiet diner not far from Union Station. A television mounted above the counter displayed news about the collapsing Soviet economy. Customers barely watched. A waitress refilled Daniel's coffee. "Crazy world," she said casually. Daniel nodded. If only you knew, he thought. If only you knew how many nights men sat underground, wondering whether sunrise would arrive. Years passed. Technology advanced. The internet emerged. New geopolitical conflicts replaced old ones. But Daniel increasingly believed the Cold War contained lessons future generations might forget dangerously. Mainly this: civilization often survives not because systems are perfect, but because imperfect human beings choose restraint during moments of fear. He began writing notes, not official memoirs, just observations, memories, fragments of conversations, descriptions of rooms filled with cigarette smoke and tension, accounts of false alarms that nearly changed history. He never intended publication. Perhaps he simply wanted proof that those years had truly happened. In 1998, a young journalist interviewed him for an oral history project about the Cold War veterans. The journalist expected stories about spies and dramatic confrontations. Instead, Daniel mostly described exhaustion, waiting, confusion, the endless burden of uncertainty. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked, "What was the scariest moment?" Daniel considered the question carefully. The interviewer probably expected him to mention the Cuban Missile Crisis or some classified emergency. Instead, Daniel answered, "The quiet moments." The journalist frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel stared out the window before replying. People imagine history happening during speeches or explosions. Most dangerous moments are quieter than that. A man looking at a radar screen, someone misreading information, somebody too tired to think clearly. That's how the world almost ended. The journalist stopped writing. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Daniel realized then that younger generations viewed the Cold War almost romantically sometimes. Spy movies, nuclear standoffs, political drama. They did not understand how deeply mundane the danger often felt. A paperwork error, a malfunctioning computer chip, a misunderstood military exercise. Human civilization balancing on ordinary mistakes. In 2001, Daniel watched smoke rise from the World Trade Center on television after the September 11th attacks. Like millions of Americans, he felt shock and grief. But he also noticed something else. For the first time in decades, younger Americans suddenly experienced a sense of vulnerability older Cold War generations knew intimately. Not nuclear fear specifically, but uncertainty. The realization that ordinary mornings could transform instantly. History never truly stops. Threats change shape. Human anxiety adapts. Yet the Cold War remained unique in one terrifying respect. It was the first period in human history when civilization possessed both the technology and readiness to destroy itself completely within hours. Previous wars devastated nations. Nuclear war threatened the species itself. That knowledge altered politics, psychology, culture, science, and diplomacy permanently. Daniel lived long enough to see historians gain access to previously classified Soviet documents after the Cold War ended. Some revelations stunned him. American leaders had misunderstood Soviet intentions repeatedly. Soviet leaders had misunderstood American intentions repeatedly. Both sides often operated from exaggerated fears. At certain moments, each believed the other might strike first. The danger had been even greater than many insiders realized at the time. One particular document haunted Daniel deeply. It described how certain Soviet commanders came to assuming NATO exercises were preparations for actual nuclear attack during 1983. He sat alone reading the translated report in his study. Outside, Colorado snow drifted quietly across pine trees. Inside, an old man realized again how narrowly humanity had escaped catastrophe. He poured himself coffee with trembling hands, then laughed softly. Because after all the classified briefings, strategic doctrines, military technologies, and geopolitical theories, the survival of civilization sometimes depended upon individuals deciding not to panic. A Soviet officer doubting radar data, an American analyst requesting additional confirmation, someone somewhere choosing caution over fear. That realization both comforted and terrified him. Near the end of his life, Daniel received an invitation to speak at a university history symposium about the Cold War. He initially declined, then reconsidered. The audience consisted mostly of students born after the Soviet Union collapsed. To them, the Cold War resembled ancient history, something contained in documentaries, not lived memory. Daniel stood behind a podium beneath bright auditorium lights. The students appeared attentive but relaxed. Many held smartphones, some whispered quietly. Normal young people living in a world that no longer practiced nuclear attack drills in schools. Daniel suddenly felt emotional, not because he disliked younger generations, because he envied them. He began speaking softly. When people discuss the Cold War, they usually talk about presidents and missiles and ideology.
The auditorium quieted. But I want you to understand something else. He paused. For 40 years, thousands of ordinary people woke up every day believing civilization might accidentally end before dinner. Nobody moved. Daniel described underground command centers, false alarms, exhausted radar operators, the psychological burden of maintaining nuclear readiness constantly. He explained how close calls often resulted from confusion rather than aggression. At one point, a student raised her hand. "Did you think nuclear war was inevitable?" Daniel considered carefully, then answered honestly, "Some days, yes." The room remained perfectly silent. He continued, "But most people still did their jobs, raised families, went to school, fell in love, built lives. That's what history books sometimes miss. Human beings continue living even under enormous fear." After the lecture ended, several students approached him. One young man asked, "What kept the Cold War from becoming a real war?" Daniel almost answered immediately. Nuclear deterrence, diplomacy, economics, political pressure. All true, but incomplete. Finally, he said, enough people on both sides understood what losing would mean. Years later, long after Daniel Mercer died quietly in a nursing home in Colorado, historians reviewing declassified Cold War archives discovered additional incidents the public had never known. Misinterpreted satellite data, computer malfunctions, lost nuclear bombs, communication failures, submarine confrontations, moments when frightened leaders operated with incomplete information. The deeper historians looked, the more astonishing the survival of civilization appeared. The Cold War became not merely a geopolitical struggle, but a study in human restraint under unprecedented pressure. It also revealed uncomfortable truths about modern civilization. Technology increases power faster than wisdom. Governments often conceal danger to preserve stability. Fear shapes societies profoundly, and ordinary individuals inside giant systems sometimes carry responsibilities too enormous for any human mind. Today, many Cold War bunkers stand abandoned. Radar stations decay beneath Arctic snow. Missile silos become museums. Tourists visit sections of the Berlin Wall displayed behind glass. Children photograph objects that once symbolized possible human extinction. Time transforms terror into artifacts surprisingly quickly. Yet the Cold War never fully vanished. Its technologies remain, its weapons remain, its lessons remain. Somewhere tonight, military officers still monitor radar screens beneath fluorescent lights. Submarines still move silently beneath oceans. Governments still interpret incomplete information while trying to avoid catastrophic miscalculation. The machinery changed. Human nature did not. Perhaps that is why the Cold War continues fascinating Americans decades after its official end. It was not merely about communism versus capitalism, or America versus the Soviet Union. It was humanity's first sustained confrontation with the possibility of self-destruction through technology. A civilization powerful enough to annihilate itself, discovering, often clumsily, how to survive its own inventions. And hidden within that enormous global drama were countless ordinary people. Radar operators drinking cold coffee at 3 a.m., school children practicing drills beneath desks, families building fallout shelters, pilots waiting beside bombers, scientists calculating blast patterns, diplomats searching for careful language, citizens trying to continue normal life while history balanced above them. The Cold War lasted so long that many forgot how abnormal it truly was. Generations grew up assuming nuclear fear represented ordinary existence, yet there had never been another period quite like it. Never before had two rival powers possessed the ability to destroy civilization within minutes while avoiding direct war for decades. It was a paradox sustained by fear, caution, ambition, ideology, luck, and human exhaustion. Late one winter evening during his retirement years, Daniel once walked alone through falling snow near his Colorado home. The world was quiet. No sirens, no emergency briefings, no radar alerts, just wind moving through pine trees. He stopped beneath the dark sky and looked upward. For decades, those same skies had represented possible death routes for bombers and missiles. Now they looked peaceful again, at least temporarily. Daniel understood then something that younger generations often struggled to grasp. Peace is not permanent. It is maintained, carefully, repeatedly, by flawed human beings making difficult decisions under pressure. The Cold War proved humanity capable of terrifying violence. It also proved humanity capable of restraint.
both truths remain equally important. And perhaps the most astonishing part of the entire story is this. After everything, after the missiles, after the crises, after the fear, after decades spent preparing for apocalypse, most people simply went home. They returned to families, to grocery stores, to baseball games, to ordinary mornings. Civilization survived not with dramatic triumph, but with quiet continuation. The phone stopped ringing. The bombers remained grounded. The world woke up the next morning and kept moving. And for millions who lived through the Cold War, that ordinary sunrise sometimes felt miraculous.
Thank you.